Okay, maybe our last video on SOPs. And this is going to really be focused on 21 CFR. So this is something that I brought up in the last video, and I said Title 21 is applicable to non-clinical labs. And within that Title 21, there's going to be some rules and regulations that any company that works within the food or the drug areas will have to follow, laboratories especially. And part of this is going to be Title 21 CFR Part 58. And Part 58 is going to look at the SOPs that are happening within these areas and kind of outlining what's expected by an auditor or by the federal government when a laboratory worker goes in and does a job. So first off, Subpart B, it's going to be organization and personnel. So within Part 58, there is going to think of that as the chapter. There's going to be a section, and that section is Section B. And Section B is going to talk about how the company is organized and the personnel that you're hiring. So all these things that I've been telling you about SOPs and methods, well, I'm telling you it for a reason. It's just not something general of how companies are actually structured and everybody just kind of does the same thing. They all have to do the same thing. And the reason is because there's regulations in place that make them do the same thing. So here is the actual piece from Title 21, Chapter 1. It says Food and Drug Admin, Department of Health and Human Services, Subchapter A, General. And then here is Subpart B, which is what we're going to focus on, and it's Organization and Personnel. So it says each individual engaged in the conduct or responsible for the supervision of non-clinical lab study shall have education, training, and experience, or a combination thereof. So when a company makes these job advertisements that you will eventually apply for, they are probably putting in some type of degree, they are putting in some type of coursework, or they're putting in some type of previous work history as a requirement for that particular job opening. And they really can't maneuver around that too much. Now, sometimes they can, depending on how their internal SOPs are worded. But within the SOP, their personnel's or the personnel restrictions are going to have to be clearly defined. We have to know what is their purpose, what's their education that they need, what training do they need, and so forth. And if they don't meet these checklist items, then really it's a federal violation, not a company violation. So depending on how they've worded this to the auditors, well, that's one way. Now, how they word it in a job description can be another way. So for instance, if I write in and a person needs an associate's degree in a science-based curriculum, and I'm going to send this to the feds, then the feds are going to look at the people that you hire. The feds are going to look at what the incoming training is going to be, and they're going to say, do they have an associate's degree? Yes or no? Okay, that's all that they're going to look. They're not going to look necessarily at the actual job description that they push out, but they're going to cross-reference it to their internal paperwork that they use to figure out who's qualified to do certain jobs. Now, if I do a job listing and the job listing is pushed out to the public, then we can increase those requirements if we want. And that's very often a trick that certain companies do. So for instance, they might have an internal acceptance that they need an associate's degree, they need some coursework in chemistry, or a chemistry related program. Okay, great. Not a problem at all. But in the public view, they might push out a job listing and it will say preferred bachelor's degree. That means that we are going to go above and beyond our minimum. It's not a requirement, but we're preferring it. So we would like for them to have additional 2 more years of education or training in a lab or something that goes on. And that's who we're after. That's who we would like, but that's preferred. That is not minimum. So they have to meet the minimum requirement, but they can put a preferred requirement on there whenever possible. Okay. Next up for Section B, each testing facility shall maintain a summary of the training and experience for each person that's employed by the company. So again, this is not something that companies do just because they feel good. This is not something that companies do because they're well organized. Keeping those training records is a federal regulation. They have to. Part C, there should be a sufficient number of personnel for the timely and proper conduct of the study. That means that these companies can't overwork their lab workers. They can't make you work overtime. They should have enough laboratory staff to do the jobs that they are getting paid to do. And if they have a big influx of samples that have to be processed, they better have trained personnel ready to handle those samples. That's a thing that they've got to do. Next up, personnel shall take necessary personal sanitation and health precautions. So this is an idea that you might be required to change clothes by the time you get to the lab. You might have to put on a lab jacket. You might have to put on closed-toed shoes. You might have to put in a clean room suit. Depending on what area that you're working in a laboratory environment, these are all things that a company has to think about, and that should be part of the SOP as well. That could also include changing your clothes. So maybe you're there and you're working an 8-hour shift, and maybe the first 4 hours you've got something on, and the second 4 hours they want you to change and put fresh, uncontaminated clothes on, right? Another suit maybe that needs to be put on. Personnel engaged in non-clinical lab studies shall wear clothing appropriate. That kind of wraps into that. Sanitation is also the idea that you need to take a bath. You need to take showers. You shouldn't go into work stinking. You shouldn't have body odor, right? I mean, that's all part of it. And they can send you home if you violate any of those things. And then part F, any individual found at any time to have an illness that may adversely affect the quality or integrity of the laboratory study shall be excluded. So you go home. This is not a main company decision policy. So if I'm working for one of the pharma labs in Wilmington and I go home and I've got a cough, right? They're going to look at me and they're going to say, no, you're going to go home. I don't know what that cough is. I don't know if you have a cold. I don't know if you got the flu. I don't know if you got a COVID, but you're out of here. See ya. You got to go bye-bye. And you're going to stay home until you actually get better. Now, some companies might pay you for that. They might require you to take sick leave. They might require you to take some hours. Or they could do something creative and maybe give you some take-home work that you can complete online or virtually, some type of work-at-home situation for you, depending on what that company does and what their needs are. But don't be surprised if they tell you, not today, Satan, bye-bye. You're going to go home, come back when you feel better. So those are the types of things that we got to keep in mind. These are not mean companies. It's because these are federal regulations that are put in place. So, summary of what you just saw: education, training, experience, that's a have to, right? There's no way around it. Now, if they say we take anybody from the street, that's perfectly fine. But they have to identify that as a acceptable hiring qualification, okay? Next up, training records have to be kept. Very often, these training records, there could be entire departments that are just dedicated to that alone. Employers must hire appropriate staff. So you got to have the numbers that meet the testing. You have to make sure that what you're doing on a daily basis actually makes sense. You can process samples quickly, efficiently, with quality behind them. Sanitation and hygiene is important. Again, federal regulation. We want you clean. We don't want you to stink. We don't want you filthy and dirty. And we don't want you sick, right? And then appropriate clothing, also same deal. Companies will make that decision. They have to outline what those things are. As long as they follow what they outline, the federal government's okay with it. Notice it says appropriate. What's appropriate for you, for that company, might not be appropriate for someone else in a different company. So what you're going to see on this next screen is just an example of a form of an employee training log. So this would be maybe a quality control form that someone would keep in your file. And up here at the top, you'll see employee name, department, and position. And then all of the dates of the training that's going to take place with you, they'll fill those out. Area for training focus. For this particular form, it looks like a couple of different sections that you could get training in. These are like pre-printed, just makes it convenient for the trainer to fill out. Training objectives, so they would write in a 1 or 2 sentence, not even full sentences there, on what this is going to be. The type of training, so again, just a little bit of details. An online course module, a in-person, hands-on laboratory training module. They have to kind of describe what is going on here. And then the verification. So how did they know what you did actually worked and that you learned something from it? That's the purpose of the verification piece, right? So this is a way that they can say, this is what the assignment was, and this is what the laboratory worker did, and they generated data for the most part for us. And then that data was compared to the acceptable limits. And as long as it passed the acceptable limits, that means that you're doing the job really well. You're properly trained on the SOP. You did it a number of times. You just didn't get lucky. So you did it good again and again and again and again. And then here in the end, we can cross-reference that and make sure that you did your job the proper way. That's what these training logs look like. And that's what will continue to be put into your employee file when you get trained at a company, especially within the Food and Drug Administration. Because now we know this is a federal regulation, right? Next up is 21 CFR Part 58, but we're going to focus on Subpart E. Subpart E is going to be really the SOPs, just straight up SOPs. So the previous part was Part B. Part B was the organization and the personnel. So people is Part B. And then later on in that Part 58, we're going to get to the standard operating procedures. So if we take a look at the standard operating procedures, what do the federal requirements say? Part 58 says that in writing, you should provide standard operating procedures. So they do want to see a physical copy of SOPs somewhere. It might be one main folder in the lab, but a written copy should be within the laboratory or somewhere nearby that's convenient for workers. It cannot just truly be all electronic. It's not going to work, so we're going to have something as a backup plan if that goes on. More than welcome to use electronic ones. It's just that cannot be your only way to access the SOPs. It's going to say that the management is satisfied and are adequate to ensure the quality and integrity. That's always the 2 words that we're after. The quality of the data, how good is it, and the integrity of the data. Make sure that we didn't lie about it. Make sure that we feel good and we were honest and we were truthful as the data was coming out of our instrumentations, of our tests and reports, right? Any deviation that happens in the SOP, you are allowed to do that, but any deviation has to be noted and it has to be approved by authorized people. Those are typically laboratory managers or other people that are designated to have that judgment call be made. So it's got to be signed off on, but it's got to be stated in the very beginning. I didn't follow the directions at that time because this is what I did instead. Significant changes, if they're going to happen, you really have to go through management for that. This needs to take a more formal process. It has to be completely changed. It has to be fully approved. Typically, these are higher up in the company. Part of quality control and quality assurance has to be part of this as well. It can't just be a very simple local change to be like, okay, yeah, this is what we're going to do today. These are significant, which means that they will change a large portion or kind of overall target of what the SOP is all about. So standard operating procedures shall be established for the following. There's a lot of things on here that I'm not really going to focus on. Again, food and drug, it's going to be a lot of stuff that we don't really run into on a daily basis, like animal testing. Very few of us will be working in a lab that will actually have animals that are testing new pharmaceutical products and that type of thing on. It's just really in the lab facility testing material, testing ingredients, testing finished products. That's what we're most of the time going to be doing. But receipt, identification, storage, handling, mixing, method of sampling, all of these is kind of making, blending, processing, right? Every one of those people need an SOP. Laboratory test, of course. So if I'm in the lab and I'm doing the test, I'm doing the procedures, I should have an SOP for that. That's not surprising as well. Number 11, maintenance and calibration of equipment. Those people also need an SOP. So if I'm going to turn the instrument on, how do I do it? If I'm going to run samples on the equipment, how do I do it? If I'm going to calibrate the machines and make sure that they're running the proper way, how do I do that? That is step number 11. 12C says each lab area shall have immediately available lab manuals and SOPs. So again, they're hitting this message home. You should have something that's very convenient in the laboratory space that you're working in for your SOPs that you do on a daily basis. It does not need to be all of the SOPs, but what is relevant within that space. That's what has to be in those folders. Finally, D, a historical file of SOPs and all revisions shall be maintained. So again, this is not a company organization decision. This is not the company managing themselves the proper way. This is a federal requirement, and they have to do it. So it seems like a lot of paperwork. It seems like a lot of headache, and quite honestly, it is. But it's not the company's fault. It's the federal regulations' fault for them to go through these motions, to make you go through these motions. So don't put your hate out on the company owner. Don't put your hate out on the laboratory managers. You need to put your hate on the federal government for enforcing all of these regulations onto these companies. Now, with that said, I want you to keep in mind that this is oversight. That's what this is. And the thing here is that oversight is great, folks, right? I'm not saying that it's not. Someone needs to be in place to make sure shoddy little labs don't operate throughout the United States. Because you know that if that is just even an inkling of a possibility, it's going to happen. So we can have a pharmaceutical company pop up tomorrow, and the pharma company could be doing all of the quote testing and generate all of this fake data, right? I mean, that could be a thing. And if they generate all of this fake data, they're going to put it on reports. They're going to say, yeah, this is great, this is great, this is great, this is great. It passes everything. Good job, good job. Quality's there. Yeah, integrity's there. Woohoo! And no oversight is in place to make sure they're doing their job the proper way. Someone has to double check these companies. That's what this is. But there is a little Goldilocks area here where if it's too much oversight, this means it's going to take more and more money for this company to operate and for this company to stay in business. But if you have too little oversight, what's going to happen is that these companies are going to get away with anything they can get away with. All right. So for every new regulation, there's going to be something else in place that probably is going to be another job. It's going to be more time commitment. It's going to be more red tape. And if those companies don't follow that, they're going to get fined, and they could be excessively fined, and then they could go out of business because of it. So too much oversight can be bad, and too little oversight is going to be a disaster. So the nice area here is going to fall somewhere in between. Yep, you want some people overseeing stuff. You want to make sure labs are doing their job the proper way, but give them the freedom in order to make some of these decisions on their own. That's what this is all about, all right? Okay, so some highlights here. SOPs are required by the federal government. They have to be provided to each area, and they should be specific to those areas. All of the revisions and the changes have to be kept over the course of history while that SOP is in business. All previous versions have to be kept, meaning copies filed away in a filing cabinet, controlled by document people. Slight changes are going to be okayed by maybe local managers, but anything bigger than that, those are going to have to be approved by some member of management, QA, QC, or even a board of people before those changes can be implemented. So don't go into the lab one day and say, I think this is what I'm going to do today. And I'm not going to tell anybody about it, and I'm just going to do it. Because if you do and you're caught, you could get fired, right? And that's because you are violating federal regulations when you make those decisions. So next up is this 21 CFR Part 58, and this is Subpart G. So Subpart G specifically focuses on what we call the protocols, which are the things that we have to follow when we're in the lab and we're doing it. Now, some people will exchange the word protocol for SOP. Some labs allow this and some do not. So I'm not telling you if this is wrong or if this is right. But for the most part, standard operating procedures are separate from what we would define as the protocol. So I regard them as two different things, but some lab places, depending on where you work, are going to say that they mean exactly the same thing. And they kind of don't, depending on the regulations. So here is Subpart G, and it's all about the protocols. So the protocol rules, again, I highlighted a couple of these areas that I think is somewhat important. Each study shall have an approved written protocol that clearly indicates the objectives and the methods. So this is not necessarily the standard operating procedure, but it's going to be some type of form or some type of document that says, this is why we're doing the test. This is the overall goal and the overall mission of what we're trying to accomplish. That is the proper definition of a protocol. And keep in mind that protocols are specifically talked about and discussed in a separate section on the federal regulation side of the house, which means that they somewhat regard this differently as a standard operating procedure as well. One, a descriptive title and a statement of the purpose. Number two, identification of the test and the control articles by name, abstract number, or code number. So let's imagine that we're working on a new chemical compound and we're doing some tests on that chemical compound. So I'm going to have to keep track of what those things are, where are they coming from, who generated them, how did they arrive in site, how did they arrive in-house. Number three, the name of the sponsor. The sponsor is going to be the person that's paying you or your company to do the job. So let's say that we have this big pharmaceutical company and they have made this brand new product, and this product needs a couple of different methods or SOPs to test the quality of that product, the safety of that product, making sure that it's going to do what it needs to do. So that would be the sponsor. They're going to outsource some of the testing to a third party, and that third party laboratory is going to have to do some of the tests for them. So this protocol is going to include the sponsor's name and the name and address of the testing facility. So if I've got a company in Wilmington, I need to put that address on there, and I need to say, this is what my company is going to do for the sponsor. This is what my company is going to test for on these particular types of products. Notice this is different than the SOP really at the heart, right? It's just a summary. It is a document to let an auditor know what was going on, what material was getting tested, who was testing it, and where did it come from. Next, if there's any kind of animals involved, of course, those have to be documented. Where did they come from? How long have they been around? What were their ages, their body weights? Those types of things are very important for testing, especially if the company's goal is to get a drug product approved by the FDA. There are certain things that have to be documented and certain study cases that have to be submitted to the FDA for the trials that are taking place on this possible new drug product, maybe, let's say. And that's one of those things that they do look at. Next up, if I flip it over, we're still in the protocol section. It's going to be a description or identification of the diet. So notice this is not really the proper SOP, but again, it's giving a review or an overall idea of what was going on at the study or within the study. So this is more broader than the SOP. These are not just procedure steps 1, 2, 3, 4. This is what you need to follow, right? Number 9, the type and frequency of the test. Number 10, the records to be maintained. Number 11, the date of approval of the protocol by the sponsor and the signature of the study director. So this is like the agreement that's going to take place between the two companies. A statement of the proposed stat methods. This is really quality control and quality assurance. How are you reporting the information? What kind of stats are you using? What are those definitions according to you and your company, just to make sure that we're on the same page. Next up is the disqualification parameters. So for instance, if the laboratory is generating data and that data doesn't meet what we think is ideal, what disqualifies it. So again, these are acceptance windows for QA and QC. This is what they would go by, determining on if samples passed or if they failed. What happens if it does fail? What does the company do? Is there any kind of steps that the company will make toward the client or the sponsor? Do they just automatically rerun things and try it again for the second time before they provide that written notification or that contact? You know, what is going on if something does in fact get failed or rejected? And then finally here, notice of an opportunity for a hearing on the disqualification. So this is just the idea of if your company in the end says, no, this is not passing. No, this is not what you thought it was. You told us it was going to be this value. We're not getting this value. We've tried it. Sorry, it's just a no-go from us. You know, what are the parameters? What are the steps that go on? And how does that company contact the originator? And how do they discuss this failing situation? And what happens after that? So that's going to have to be determined and kind of agreed upon before the study takes place. So that way it's very clear cut what happens after the fact if things do fail in the very end. All right. So that's going to lead us into quality control forms. Again, something that's federal regulation, something that's going to have to be documented and kept throughout your time while you're at the company. And one of the take-home messages here that you're going to see, if it isn't written down, it did not happen, right? I'm going to say that again. If it's not written, it did not happen. So I know that we keep saying, we want something simple, we want something sweet, we want something very easy to read. But at the same time, you have to provide details. Details are going to be important. You can't shortchange the details in a laboratory environment. And the reason is because if you did not write down certain details, then there's no proof that those details happened. There's no proof that those things took place. And you have to document it as you do the test. And it has to be in real time. That's the other thing. So in other words, a lot of the things that we do in a laboratory have to be documented when it happens. We cannot go 1 week later down the road and say, oh God, you know what? That stuff turned blue and I forgot to write it down. Oh, let me go back and let me write in that statement and squeeze in that observation. No, you cannot do that. Details are important, but real-time details are important. So things have to be documented, and things have to be documented in real time as they happen as you're doing the procedure. It is a significant part of what the quality control and laboratory group is going to do. So as a lab worker, what will happen is that you'll do the test. And yes, we've talked about this entire time, you generate data, right? Some kind of number is going to come from the testing that you do. That value is going to be kicked to another group, and that group is just going to make sure things look good and that there's no issues that they see on their end. But at the same time, we've completely ignored another large part of the laboratory worker's role, and that's to write down observations. Observations are really regarded as data, numbers, right? But it's observational based. It's qualitative based. It's what you see, what you observe. That's what the observations are. Those details are just as important as the number details, as the quantitative data that begins to go forward. All right, so just a review, quantitative is all about the numbers, and then qualitative is all about the observations. It's what you see, what goes on, what you can record. All of that has to be documented throughout the testing that you do as a laboratory person. Another reason for this, folks, there's a form for everything, and that's because observations should be recorded. Data should be recorded. There's probably going to be a form that you have to fill out, maybe multiple forms that you have to fill out in order to ensure that data is getting reported and that observations are getting reported as well. So for instance, one of these forms would be something like a field sample form. So if I'm working in the lab and my role is to go out and gather a sample out there at a river or at a lake or whatever the case is, then there's a field sample form that I probably need to fill out. This is very common in the environmental world. but it is a part of QA and QC, and those forms have to stay on document, in the folder, in the filing cabinet, on file for any auditor at any point in time. So some of the things that the field sample form might ask is, where did you get the sample? What did you see when you collected the sample? What did the lake look like? What did the river look like? Was it rainy? Was it snowy? What was the weather like? How hot was it? Those are the types of data that will go onto the form. And then the time, of course, the date, and the location. The location very often now is done with GPS. That way we can get an exact spot of where the sample was actually located. So you can't just say, I went to the Cape Fear River to get a sample. No, you can't say that. Where exactly on the Cape Fear River? Cape Fear River is a very big river. So it's not just in Wilmington, but it expands, right? So where was it? And what are the exact GPS locations of where that sample was collected now? Because that can easily be done just through the power of technology that we have in our hands on a daily basis. All right. So a field sample form is one of these quality control forms that you might see in a lab. Other than the field sample form, something else that's kind of common is something called chain of custody. So the chain of custody form is a document that's going to look at the hands that have touched the sample. That's what this is all about, right? So who collected the sample? That's a chain of custody. Did they give that sample to someone else to let them drive it to the laboratory? That has to be documented on the chain of custody. Once the laboratory receives that sample, who actually received it? Who did the check-in? Who did the storage? So that has to be illustrated on the chain of custody form. Once that sample got into the lab and it went to the proper lab area, well, who did it then get transferred to? What person picked it up from the sample intake area and take it back to the lab in order to actually get the test done with it? That's the chain of custody form. Forensics also loves chain of custody, right? And you can kind of imagine why. If there's a police officer that gathered evidence or some type of crime scene investigator that gathered evidence, you know, whose hands touched it, who was there, who was present, sign and date it. And then drive it down to the police station, sign and date it. The police station sends it to the crime lab. Who took it? Sign and date it. Once it goes into the crime lab and it got stored, sign and date it. Whoever took it out of storage and actually did testing on it, sign and date it. That is the chain of custody form, and it is a very common form for multiple labs, not just for food and drug related areas. So the sample has to be protected from you. That's what this chain of custody form is all about. We often think about this word contamination, right? And we say, oh my God, I don't want to be contaminated by my sample. Is it poison? Is it going to kill me? I don't want to handle it. I don't want to breathe it. I don't want to put it on me. Well, that's great. You should have that attitude. But at the same time, you can contaminate the sample as well. And the sample is saying the same thing. The sample's there in its little jar. The sample's there in its little bottle. And it's saying, oh no, who's got their hands on me? Where am I going? Where am I getting transported to? What's this dark holding area that I'm in? When are they going to come back? When are they going to touch me? Oh no, I'm getting scooped out of the bottle. Who's doing it? Their hands are all over me. Did they handle it the proper way? Because you can contaminate the sample as easy as the sample contaminating you. And that's the purpose, or one of the purposes, of the chain of custody form. Another form that you will often see is a preservation form, of course. This is also wrapped up in quality control, quality assurance. It's part of federal regulations. So if the sample does have to be preserved, who did it? When did they do it? And how did they do it? I mean, that's what the preservation form is all about. So a lot of times sample intake is going to be the people that would fill out this form, because sometimes the samples come directly to the lab, and the sample intake people will make sure the preservation is in place. If it needs to go into the refrigerator, then they will put it in the fridge. If it needs to go in the freezer, they'll put it in the freezer. If it needs to go and get acidified, then they will make sure it gets acidified in some form or fashion. So that's the purpose of the preservation form. That is keeping track of how the sample has been handled and preserved from the moment of collection all the way until it gets tested. Now, I know that we keep talking about environmental stuff a lot of times with these preservation forms, but I want you to think of a drug that we would call an active pharmaceutical ingredient, an API, right? So the API is going to get made by a company, and that company is going to send the API to a third-party lab to get tested. Folks, that's transportation. That is preservation. That is storage, right? So from the time that the API is made, how is it handled? Did it go and get chilled in a cooler? Did it go into a freezer? Did it get just put into a Ziploc bag and be dropped off on a certain date and time 1 week later after this sample was kind of placed into the mail or in the delivery system? I mean, what's going on with the transportation? It happens with drugs just like it happens with anything else. So preservation, again, is more than just food and drug. It's everywhere. Environmental for sure here in this particular case. All right. So this document would say who did it, when did they do it, how did they do it. Again, a checklist could be there, check, check, check. But some SOPs need to be written on how to properly handle these particular things to make sure the integrity of the sample stays in existence. Next up is instrument and calibration. This, again, is going to be part of regulations, and now we know federal regulations of Title 21, and the instrument and calibration could have forms as well, and it's all about the equipment. Keep in mind that if the equipment doesn't have any sample at all, it should still make sure that it works. We should still go through the motions of running something and be like, yep, this is still good. It's good to go. So that way, when you get samples in the lab and you need that machine's going to be ready for you, right? So very often, if we're not using a machine, we're still in the lab and there's going to be a group that's going to be running things on that machine and be like, yep, everything looks great. Oh no, data's kind of getting wonky. We probably need to replace this, or we need to do some maintenance on that. It just helps ensure that the instrumentation is going to be ready for you when you actually need it for the lab studies that you begin to do. So regular basis, all the time, something that's going to get checked, whether it's by you and running quality checks, or whether it's by another internal group that works with the company called a metrology group. Those are the people that do these calibrations a lot of times, or a third-party group, which would be like the instrumentation manufacturer. They would come down, make sure it works really well, sign off on some data sheets, and away they go. All right. So these are just simple tests, making sure everything is working according to plan. So those will also have forms, and that will have to be placed in a folder, in a filing cabinet, and you got to make sure that an auditor has access to those whenever they need it. Finally, here's just another form. It's just an example. This is a instrumentation log form. So notice up here at the top it says calibration log for a measuring and testing device, and it says QC inspection form number 7. Here's the data calibration. So if I worked for the metrology group at a company, I would go in and date it, and I would say, well, I'm going to maybe calibrate the TOC instrument today. So description of measuring and testing device. So total organic carbon analyzer. I would probably have some type of ID number. There's a chance that the company would have more than one TOC instrument. And if so, that's great. That's not an issue at all. But it would have an identifier number on it. So I could write that number down, like an inventory number. Device ID number would be for that reason as well, just to kind of hit home the fact that you should specifically lay out what machines are which ones, especially have you more than one. The calibration standard or the procedure. So how did you calibrate it? What did you follow? Write some brief directions here. Refer to an SOP. Do something in this section so an auditor will know how you actually calibrated it. The certificate or report number, again, you probably get some kind of data from the machine. This proves that the machine is calibrated and it's working the proper way. So attach that report number, attach those reports, do something so that way you've got proof and justification that yes, you did your job, you did it the right way. This thing is working as of today because you're the one that double checked it. And then the date to be recalibrated. So when should someone else go in? Probably on a routine schedule tomorrow or next week or next year? When would someone go back in and do the same thing that you just did to keep ensuring that the equipment is working the proper way? So just another example of a quality control form that you're seeing on the screen right now. And of course, there's more than this, right? There's forms on top of forms that someone has to keep track of, that someone has to maintain and put away in a nice little management filing cabinet and electronically for the most part now. So that way it's easily accessible whenever it's requested. So that's my story on SOPs. A little bit of an idea that the federal government does regulate some of this stuff. They put measures in place for these companies to follow, and these companies have to filter them down to the lab workers because that is their responsibility as a company. And it's your responsibility to make sure that these forms are filled out the proper way, that they're documented the proper way, because these can trickle all the way back up to these rules and regulations where the company could get fined and maybe invalidate the data from the company, and they're going to lose massive amount of monies because of a mistake or a couple of mistakes that you did on some forms. And nobody wants that to happen. So don't hate the company. Don't hate the lab owner. Don't hate your laboratory manager. That is not their role. They did not come up with these crazy ideas. These ideas came from the government. So that's the person that you need to put the blame on. But you know what, folks? Nothing we can really do about it. We just got to do it. There's got to be some oversight. And this is one of the ways that they will oversight these companies to make sure they're doing their job the proper way. All right, so that finishes up our methods and SOPs. I might give you a couple of examples of SOPs, maybe not. If so, you'll see those up here in the module folder. More than welcome to click on them, review them, take a look at what they are. I'm not going to ask specific details on any of those. I just think that sometimes it's important for you to see real SOPs and for you to see real forms that these companies will utilize throughout the daily life of a lab worker. So if you see them, click on them, glance through them, quickly skim them. But other than that, I'd say you did your job and you did your job pretty good. So good luck on the online assignments. If you got questions, please let me know. That finishes up methods and SOPs. And then we're going to move on to our first maybe actual method and SOP that we're going to follow in our own lab with quality control data.